Hi, everyone. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and good morning to all of our colleagues joining us from Azerbaijan. My name is Elizabeth Goffey, and I am a project manager with the U.S. Department of the Interior's International Technical Assistance Program. And I am also the department lead for the Ambassador's Water Experts Program. I am so glad to have you here with us today for our first session of this series, organized in partnership with the U.S. Embassy in Baku. Before I hand things over to my colleagues at the embassy for their opening remarks, I just wanted to share a few reminders about today's event. 1. This session is available in both English and Azerbaijani. To select your preferred language, please click on the round globe icon at the bottom of your screen. 2. This session will be recorded, and we will share the link for your future reference and distribution. To preserve the audio quality, we kindly request that you remain on mute unless you are presenting or asking a question. If necessary, we will mute people who are causing excessive background noise. 3, there will be dedicated time at the end reserved for questions and answers, but please feel free to add your questions to the chat as we go, and we will be sure to collect them. And lastly, 4, if you have any technical issues, please reach out to me, Elizabeth Goffey, via the chat box or over email at egoffey@ios.doi.gov. I will put that in the chat, and I will be happy to assist you. With that, I would like to turn things over to my colleague at the U.S. Embassy in Baku, Blake Dogger. Blake?
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everyone. Good evening. My name is Blake Doggart, and I'm with the U.S. Embassy here in Baku. First, I want to say how happy I am that we are here today. I want to give my warm welcome to participants from the Ministry of Ecology and the Azerbaijan State Agricultural University. Today, Avra Morgan, Kevin Thielen, Dr. Marketa McGuire, all from the Bureau of Reclamation, will be speaking with us, and I want to give my welcome to them as well. The Bureau of Reclamation is the U.S. Water Resource Management Agency under the Department of the Interior. The Bureau of Reclamation plans programs and initiatives for irrigation, water supply, and hydroelectric power generation in the Western United States. So as you know, this year represents our 30th, the U.S. and Azerbaijan's 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations. And we look forward to continuing to build and strengthen our cooperation in the areas of priority for both of our countries. So I know that this particular event has been almost a year in the making, and I just want to express how much we appreciate the work of the Azerbaijani Ministry of Ecology and the U.S. Department of the Interior to make this happen. This is, of course, just the beginning, not only for the Ambassador's Water Expert Program, but also for our continuing conversation surrounding water resource management issues and the ongoing efforts to address the impacts of climate change. I am delighted for what's in store today's session. And with that, I will turn it over to Avra Morgan. Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm Avra Morgan with the Bureau of Reclamation in Denver, Colorado. And my internet has been coming and going. So if it goes out, I'll try joining on my phone. But for now, we're really grateful to be here today and appreciate your inviting us to speak with you. Elizabeth, should we go around the room and do introductions?
That would be wonderful. Thank you.
Okay, I'll hand it over to, I'll say first that as I said, I work in the Denver office of the Bureau of Reclamation. I work on water policy and water programs, and we develop programs and implement them in the Western United States. And I will turn it over to my colleague, Kevin Thielen. Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself next?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Kevin Thielen. I'm typically housed in Reclamation's California Great Basin Regional Office, where I conduct climate change analysis on the infrastructure we have in California. However, I'm now working under a temporary position with Avram Morgan on a lot of our larger scale reclamation-wide activities pertaining to climate change, including the Basin Studies program that we're going to be talking about a little more here. And then I will pass it off to my colleague, Stephanie Meisick.
Hello, everyone. Stephanie Meisick here. I am located in Montana. I am a civil engineer, and I primarily tasked with doing water operations for our reservoirs, delivering irrigation water to our partners, scheduling hydropower production, as well as working with all our other interests for recreation and fish and wildlife purposes. Thank you. And I will hand it over to Marquetta.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marquetta McGuire. I am a hydrologic civil engineer for the Bureau of Reclamation, and I also work in our office in Denver, Colorado. My specialties are related to studies of water supply and demand, particularly thinking about the impacts of climate change. I also support reclamation as a whole in our various offices in long-term water resources planning and modeling of surface hydrology as well as river systems. And I just really look forward to speaking with you today. Thanks.
Looks like Marquetta and I are.
Avra, I think we lost you there for a second. Can you still hear us? Give her a second to reconnect. Avra, can you hear us now?
I can.
Okay, your video is frozen, but we can hear you, I believe.
Looks like we may have lost Avra. I'm fine to share the slides. However, maybe we do give it a minute. I see she reconnected maybe.
That sounds good. Otherwise, I appreciate your willingness to share your screen.
I mean, I think because I don't think this problem seems like it's going to continue, so maybe we just start.
Yeah, I am here. But I think, let's see, I'm trying to decide if I should just join on my phone. Maybe that will be better. But it might take me a minute to get to the Zoom.
That's quite all right. We can take this moment for Kevin to go ahead and share his screen and we can get everything started. And then Avra, once you're able to rejoin, we'll kick off the presentation. Does that sound all right?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Of course. Thanks everyone for bearing with us with the technical difficulties. Looks wonderful. Thank you, Kevin.
It's figuring out Zoom again.
I know, right? Every platform does it slightly differently.
Yeah.
So we'll
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Maybe we will just go ahead like this and I'll keep my camera off. That seems to help. So sorry, folks, for the rough start here. We'll go ahead and get going. We're going to talk to you a little bit about our Basin Study program. And Kevin, you'll advance the slides.
Yep, can do.
Great. So first, just a little bit about the Bureau of Reclamation. The Bureau of Reclamation is an agency within the United States Department of the Interior, and we are responsible for managing water and power in the Western United States within the 17 Western states shown here on the screen. There are 8 major reclamation river basins. These are the river basins that we are primarily responsible for in the Western US. You'll see the Colorado River Basin there in the middle, which people tend to be familiar with. But there's also the Columbia River Basin up in the Pacific Northwest, the Missouri River Basin in the northeastern part of the West, the Rio Grande River Basin, the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and the Klamath River Basins. Reclamation provides water for many different types of water uses, including irrigated agriculture, but also to cities, and also for the environment and for recreational purposes. We are also the second largest producer of hydroelectric power in the United States, and we operate 53 power plants and 338 reservoirs across the West. Next slide. So just a bit of an overview about how water is managed in the United States. The states, not the federal government, have primary responsibility over the allocation of water. They set the laws for how water is administered and allocated within each state. And they also oversee and enforce those laws. So if water is being used irresponsibly, it is the responsibility of the state, not the federal government, to enforce local requirements on how water should be used. The federal government does hold some water rights and has authority over interstate water bodies and sets federal water policy. The role of the federal government is to control those interstate water bodies and also serve as a special water master on some interstate rivers, including the Colorado River. And then we set federal water policy and we support the states. And you'll hear throughout our presentation that we work in partnership with many different types of non-federal entities, including states, irrigation and water districts, municipalities, tribes, and local governments like cities and counties. Next slide. So our program that we're here to talk to you about today is called WaterSMART, and it's an umbrella really that includes several different program activities that are all focused on water management. And the purpose of these programs is to work with those non-federal partners. So even though we supply water and we manage large reservoirs across the West, and we contract water out to water users, but like I said before, we're not primarily responsible for the administration of water laws, but we do support the management of water and water policy. And we do that through programs like the Basin Study Program that we're going to focus on today. Basin Study Program is one of these several different activities that we have within WaterSMART, where we work with local and non-federal entities to help them improve their water management through different means. Basin Study Program is focused on collaborative planning. The Title 16 Water Reuse and Recycling Program is supportive of developing water recycling facilities and using recycled water, providing funding for infrastructure to support the use of recycled water. WaterSMART Grants is focused on water conservation and efficiency. And the Water Conservation Field Services Program is a locally administered federal program by our local federal offices that supports water planning. The Drought Response Program also includes funding for projects to help water managers cope with drought conditions. And finally, the Cooperative Watershed Program is supportive of local watershed groups that are typically implementing watershed restoration programs where they undertake planning and projects to support environmental water uses. Next slide. To focus in a little more, this is the topic of our presentation today, the Basin Study Program. This is a program that has been in place since 2010. And it is a program that supports planning efforts, science-based water resources planning. These are collaborative planning studies that are focused on a basin-wide scale and look at water supply and demand imbalances. So they assess whether there are imbalances in water supply and demand, and then we work together with our non-federal partners to identify approaches to help address any shortfalls that we see now or that we see coming in the future. Those non-federal partners that we work with on these studies include states, tribes, cities, and entities with water delivery authority. Many times those are irrigation and water districts in the United States. And those parties, those non-federal partners, participate on a voluntary basis. And we provide 50% of the cost share, and then the non-federal partners also provide 50% of the cost of the study. Next slide. So what motivates non-federal partners to participate in basin studies? Why are these folks, these non-federal entities coming to us and wanting to work with us? Through these studies, we provide technical expertise. So instead of requiring the non-federal parties to conduct all of the technical analysis, the Bureau of Reclamation's experts come to the table and help conduct the modeling and the analysis that goes into these studies in partnership with those non-federal entities. And then we also provide 50% of the funding. But maybe the most important thing is that we provide a framework for collaboration. Reclamation serves as a neutral facilitator that can bring together partners who might not otherwise be willing to collaborate and work together. Frequently, there are conflicts over water in the Western United States, and having the federal government there with a planning program for people to participate in and collaborate in can help parties come together, and instead of, I guess, seeking each other out in lawsuits in the courts or fighting over water, it gives them a place to come and collaborate and see if we can find solutions collectively. Next slide. So the basin studies are made up of 4 basic elements. They include projections of future water supply and demand using global climate models. And that's how we assess the impacts of climate change to water within a particular river basin. The second element is an analysis of how the basin's existing water and power operations and infrastructure will perform in response to the projections of future water supplies and demand. So looking ahead, how will the basin, both the infrastructure and the operations and the water supply and demand, how is this going to perform going forward given what we know about climate change? Third, the basin studies include the development of adaptation and mitigation strategies to improve operations and infrastructure to supply adequate water in the future. And they also include a trade-off analysis to look at the various adaptation options that were identified and identify the best approach forward following the study. Next slide. So I guess the question is, what motivates someone to perform a basin study? What are the motivating issues? These tend to be whether there's an insufficient water supply for people or the environment or agriculture. Also questions about how the system is currently functioning, what are the weaknesses, and if there's inadequate tools to achieve water management goals. And some areas or regions sometimes have a particular focus on water quality or maybe water quantity due to drought. These are the types of things that motivate our stakeholders to want to perform a basin study. And I believe this is my last slide. And at this point, I'd like to hand over the presentation to my colleague, Stephanie Meisick.
Thank you, Avra. Well said. I'll continue on. And this slide, pretty much we talk about what are those issues. We try to identify in each of your watersheds or basin, what are those potential needs that you have. Such the issues could be drought, like Avra mentioned. In the US here in the Western states, we have a lot of diminishing snowpack. It could be water quality. What's the future water availability, excuse me, look like in the future? Are there certain needs from one area compared to another? What is your crop consumption use look like in the future? Is your towns and cities growing? So we need to look at maybe potential issues with municipal and industrial needs in the future. So as Avra said, you know, this basin study helps to address those issues. And as you can see, she talked about, you know, the basin study will help you examine the timing and the quantity of how your basin availability of your water runs off in your basin. It will talk about future temperature and precipitation patterns in your area. It could also help address any kind of changes to your groundwater recharge systems and how does that look for each individual user. The basin study also will help look at projected water and supply demands. So we got to identify what your issues are and then have the basin study help to address those and what it looks like for your area in the future. Next slide. So as Avra mentioned earlier on, the Colorado River Basin is an important basin for us. We'll talk about this throughout the presentation about examples of what we have done there to help you understand what a basin study looks like. But right now, the Colorado provides water to about 40 million people. We have about 5.5 million irrigated lands that the water supplies to, as well as it provides water to 7 US states and also to the country of Mexico. So we have international commitments for that basin as well. And as you can see, there's many others that are included in this basin. We've got 22 federal recognized tribes. There's 7 national wildlife refuges. There's 4 national recreation areas and 11 national parks. So as you can tell, it's a very complicated system and it's very important to us. So we want to make sure that we are using the water as best as we can. Next slide. So specifically, the Colorado River Basin system has been through many extended drought periods. We've also looked at different competing environmental needs, such as endangered species acts that have competing needs for this water. We've also seen huge population growth that have also exacerbated the demand on the water. With that growth, we've also saw some needs for infrastructure improvements. With that too, we come with more population, more power demands. If we don't have the available water to produce the hydropower, how are we going to supply that demand to those towns? And as I mentioned before, those international commitments are very important to this river system as well. So those are just a few things in the Colorado system that are specific examples that we looked at that we'll talk about later on in this presentation as well. Next slide. So let's talk a little bit about before we actually begin a basin study. So before we dive into a basin study, what are some of the basic things that we need to look at to see if we can even perform one? So the first action we probably want to look at is data inventory. What do you have available regarding your water supply and demand? Do you have enough information to even get started with a study? The second action would be, again, like Avra mentioned, building that collaboration. What are your existing partnerships? Who needs to be at the table? Let's start talking about that. The third action is modeling capabilities. What existing models and technical capabilities do you have in your area? Do you have to go find someone else to help you with the study? And lastly, we need to create a plan of study. Plan of study helps you outline the tasks, timeline, costs, who's involved, and helps you guide the study throughout the process. Next slide. So the first action, what data is available? So we mostly want to look at the historic supply and demand. So again, what data is available in your area for agriculture, urban demand? What are the sources of water, groundwater, surface water? How does that interact? Where can you get that data from? We need to start identifying that. Also the historical climate data. What is the observed in paleo data? Observed is the recent history that you have on, temperature, precipitation. What kind of weather patterns do you have? Do you have snowpack in your area? What are the recent stream flow gauges saying? The paleo data, again, that's much later that we don't have information for, but we'll get into that in a minute, for using tree rings to help collect that data as well. The infrastructure, what's in your area for reservoirs, conveyance system? We need a list of all of that in order to start a basin study. And then also identify the water management. Who owns what water? How is it administered? Are there any legal questions, obligations that we have to identify before we get started that may be showstoppers for this? Who decides where the water goes? How is it delivered? So all this data needs to be inventoried, wrote down, figured out before we even start a basin study to know our baseline of where we're going. Next. So specifically the Colorado River Basin, they used stream flow gauges, temperature and precipitation from our National Weather Service that's been collected over the past 30, 40 years. We've looked at different demands that have been taken from our reservoirs. We look at our irrigation districts for crop consumption uses. We look at municipalities and how much water they've delivered. So we're collecting all this data to help eventually have inputs into this basin study modeling. The Colorado River, they have about 10 major reservoirs that they've modeled. They've got over 4,000 megawatts of generating capacity that they have identified. And then also they've looked at the laws and regulations for the compacts and the treaties that would also go into some of the rules based in the modeling. On the left-hand side, you can see that this is just a graph of some of that data for the supply and demand. On the axis, you've got the calendar year on the bottom, and the y-axis, you've got the volume, millions of acre feet. And as you can see in the graph, the dark blue line is the 10-year running average of the basin water use. And that pink line that's kind of scraggly throughout is the actual 10-year running average of the water supply. So as you can see, the data is compiled that the water use is continuing to go up over the years, as well as the water supply has declined in the recent years. So again, that's kind of an issue for the Colorado Basin Study to try to figure out what's going on and how can we solve this problem. Next slide. So the second action is to build collaboration. I've already mentioned this, that, typically these problems start as a small group. You're identifying what the concerns and issues are, and then those group of people go back out and find more stakeholders, get more interest, figure out who's affected by the problems. And once those stakeholders are identified, we get those to a group to help build the process of trust and understanding between them, figure out common goals, and then eventually bring that whole group together to participate in a basin study where everybody has a common goal to solve the problems, and your complete participation in the study is desired. Next slide. So the Colorado River, this is one part of their collaborators. When they did their water supply and demand study, they've got hydropower interests, they've got ecosystem demand interests, local conservation organizations are included in that. Like we've talked about endangered species, our Fish and Wildlife Service helps out with those particular interests. General public, any interested stakeholders groups that are out there, they're invited to the table. Any kind of tribal or any communities that are out there, the states we've mentioned, those guys are coming to the table, as well as recreation is important as well. Our National Park Service has come to the table, concessionaires, anybody and everybody that's affected by this needs to be represented in this basin study. So here's just examples of what the Colorado Basin had stakeholders come to the table. Next. So the third is modeling capabilities. Again, What is your area of expertise? What models are currently available? What models will need to be created? That helps get into your timelines. Who is the keeper of the model? Like Avra mentioned, Reclamation's partnerships with these. Who has the technical capability to run these models? All these questions need to be answered and thought about prior to starting a basin study. Next slide, please. So specifically for the Colorado River Basin, they had existing planning models already up and running that showed how the water moves throughout the watershed and how it's delivered and used. So that was a big benefit starting the basin study. There was already some templates already created for managing the river system. Specifically for the basin study, the models and data were developed and maintained by Reclamation, but it was shared with all of those previous stakeholders we mentioned. Those stakeholders then review the model, the inputs, the outputs, and they compare them with their own modeling. So it's not a closed door situation. It's openly shared. There's questions being exchanged, answers, thoughts. So again, back to that collaboration partnership with everybody. The specific one that's shown on the right-hand side is called a riverware model. That's what we've used for a lot of our basin studies. It simulates operations. There's 12 reservoirs that are modeled, and it delivers over 500 individual water users. And our model here is specifically on a monthly time step. There's other models that are more refined that you can do daily or even yearly, but this one was chose to do a monthly. Next slide. And last action 4 is to create a plan of study. Again, we need to write down all this information. What's the purpose? What's the need? What are the water supply demands, concerns? What are the complexity of the problems? What are their stakeholders' commitments? Who did you bring to the table? What are they willing to do? What are they willing to participate? All this kind of needs to be written down in a concise document so everybody's on the same page. Again, the task will be outlined. We'll get into this later. Kevin will get into more specific of those 4 elements that Avra mentioned. Again, the plan of study needs major milestones, deliverables. How much is it going to cost? How much is it going to take? How much time is it going to take? What are your funding sources? As Avra mentioned, our basin study is a 50-50 cost share. So who else can bring money to the table? And also to identify your study team. Who's going to be involved? Who's going to do what? And get that whole package together prior to starting a basin study to have that outline ready to go. Next slide, please. So for the Colorado River, the plan of study for their basin study was the cost was approximately a $2 million project. As we said, it's a 50-50 cost share. So 1 million came from the federal share and 1 million came from the non-federal share. There was 38 stakeholder groups, so a lot of collaborators on this project, and it took about 2 years to complete the study. They started it back in 2010 and they completed it in 2012. So this is about a 10-year-old project, but still very viable today. And again, the tasks that were identified where they were looking out to the future to 2060. They assessed options for resolving those water and supply demand imbalances, and they developed recommendations to address the current imbalances, as well as an assessment of the potential impacts of the climate variability and climate change on those options. So again, just an example of a snapshot of some of the things that they looked at within the Colorado Basin study. Next slide. So now we'll jump into what an actual basin study does, and I will hand this over to Kevin to explain more. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. Elizabeth, I'll just mention, we did identify that this is a potential breakpoint, if that's of interest. If not, I think we find to keep going through. Just thought
I appreciate the heads up. I think we're running a little bit ahead of schedule, actually. So I think we can go ahead and keep going.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, so Stephanie's laid a lot of the groundwork for what we do prior to beginning a basin study and sort of the steps we help walk people through to get them up to this step. I'm going to be talking about the 4 primary components of the basin study and what we set out in the program to build knowledge of the basin for all the stakeholders involved. And these are, the first one being to actually develop these future supply and demand scenarios. So try and make some projections of what might your hydrology be in the future? What might it look like? Things such as, will the average shift? Will you get precipitation or snow? Will that happen at different times of the year than historically? And then to couple that with expectations of demand. So these might be straightforwardly things like population growth, any changes to agricultural demand. This might either look at expanded agricultural area, so an increase in demand, or increase in the efficiency of technologies for agriculture, so a decrease there, as well as for manufacturing industry and some other concerns. With these projections of both the water supply and the demand, we then do a bit more of a detailed analysis to look at the projected future imbalances in those. So this would be taking those supplies and those demands, putting them through those planning models that Stephanie discussed a little bit about for the Colorado River Basin, and seeing how the system, if the system is in balance year round or on average for those 10 years or at different temporal and spatial scales. Following that, based on the lessons learned from this projected supply and demand imbalance, we have an exercise of developing potential strategies to address the issues that we've highlighted might occur on the horizon or do currently exist in the system. So potential, do we need to build additional reservoirs to combat prolonged drought might be an example. But that and more, and really in this is also where the building collaboration comes strongly into effect, with seeing who can do what and who is impacted by what. And then with the last task, kind of taking this all together to look at these proposed adaptation and mitigation strategies, put them into a couple of different packages and see how well or not do they do at enhancing the performance of the reservoir system under climate change. So do these options allow us to meet more of our targets or our demands in future hydrology or in current hydrology? And then to inform potential paths forward after the basin study for pursuing actions or trying to revise other ones. So the first task, and on each of these, I'm going to talk a bit generally about what we try and do in the basin study, and then tie it back to the Colorado River Basin study with some examples of what was done in that case. So the first task for developing the future supply and demand scenarios, again, it's the analysis of the basin water supply and demand to quantify the current and future water supply from either existing hydrology, either observed information, some of these paleo records, or the general circulation models, oftentimes called global climate models, and evaluate this information to see what the existing state of the system is and what just the projected state of these inflows and requirements are. So for the Colorado River Basin, we took three approaches to simulating what future climate might look like, or what the future hydrology might look like for the system. The first of these is nothing changed. Everything, it goes on as it has been in the observed record. So just using the historical data for stream flows, precipitation, temperatures, demand, and evapotranspiration. If this was what happens up to 2060, 2062, these 50 years in the future, what would happen? Another approach is to use paleohydrology, and in this case, data derived from tree rings to make inferences about water supply. In this case, we know there exists droughts, periods of droughts and intensity of droughts, as well as intensity and frequency of storms that have happened in the historic record that maybe we haven't seen in these past 50 years, but we want to be able to incorporate that in our planning. So we've got an approach that uses that sort of informed hydrology. And then looking more towards the future for incorporating aspects of climate change as set out by the UN's International Panel on Climate Change programs, climate change assessments. They use these general circulation models to say in the future, what will happen to things such as drought, snowfall, precipitation, and et cetera. So these are our three basic buckets that we're developing potential water supply projections with. For the last one, I'll just touch in a little bit more detail, the workflow that is used for going from these general circulation models, often called global climate models, to something that's applicable to a smaller system, such as a watershed or a basin, to be studied. So at a high level, these start out with projections of what future emissions might look like. So what is the concentration of carbon dioxide or carbon dioxide equivalent in the atmosphere, and how might that affect climate systems? That is put through these general circulation models. Those results are popularly sort of published in the IPCC's climate change reports. But they kind of have a really large resolution of about 250 to 600 kilometers, which isn't quite adequate for planning things more at the 1 to 10 kilometer scale. Becomes quite important for these lakes, rivers, reservoirs, etc. So to go from that to a smaller scale, so say those more like 1 kilometer, 5 kilometer, 10 kilometers, we do a variety of bias correction and spatial downscaling. There's a whole host of methods that, if that's of interest, Marketa has a lot of expertise on. We could talk a bit about that in the discussion section, but I'll leave it for now. And then these more fine grid products are put onto a hydrologic model to tell us what the volume of water going through a particular stream might be on either a monthly time step in this case, or could even be daily or annually, depending on the need. And then this also gets bias corrected to more represent what we've observed, to just train to existing data. These climate systems are kind of necessary to model the complex interactions between the atmosphere, land surface, ocean, and sea ice that drive climate patterns that do impact us at the local scale. So they will impact what we see for weather in the Colorado River Basin. However, the details of those are less of interest than, say, how much rain is falling here when, and is it falling as rain or snow? So just a note on that. For the water demand scenarios, a little bit more maybe of an upfront picture is 3 different demand scenarios were generated for the Colorado River Basin study. And these include specifically looking at the existing demand data, so these current trends, and assuming this goes in the same way. So population growth continues as it has in the past 10, 15 years. Development of agriculture or cities goes up in the same way. An alternative to that is if the growth is slower than we might expect, so simply modifying that trend, reducing it a little bit, and saying, maybe the economy and the population don't grow as fast. Does that put different demands at different times on the system, or how does it impact it? And similarly, how we went below the current trends, also a rapid growth case, where we look at rapid population growth, increasing demands, focused on urban centers that also has a corresponding increase in, say, what happens to agricultural land availability as well as demands. So now that we have our supply and demand scenarios, we want to look at how the imbalances occur. So we're going to take these water supply and demand scenarios, put them into this planning model that simulates how water is passed through our system, who it's passed to, and what time it's passed to on this monthly time step that Stephanie mentioned, to identify existing shortcomings in the system, see what shortcomings might be on the horizon. In the case of our general circulation model, our future informed climate change hydrology, and try and answer why those imbalances occur to set up sort of the stage for these future tasks. And then we'll also compare these likely future operating conditions to the present and historical data sets to see that what does the performance look like in the future, and how does that stack up to what we have seen or what we know exists in the paleo record. For the Colorado River, they also released a water supply and demand study. And this, as Stephanie mentioned, was to look at water supply and demand imbalances over the next 50 years. So the study date was released in 2012. So here our graph on the right goes to 2062. And this was to develop and evaluate opportunities for resolving imbalances. And this was conducted by Reclamation, the 7 US states that are members of this Colorado River Basin, as well as this whole host of stakeholders that Stephanie went over. But now I'm going to talk a little bit about this graph. So the left side of this graph is the same graph that Stephanie showed a little bit earlier. Here, the y-axis is in million acre feet, it's the volume of water, and million acre feet is the unit we use, but it's about equivalent to 1.2 cubic kilometers of water. So we have the water supply of a 10-year running average and the water use for a 10-year running average. Water supply is in blue, water use is in red. Up from 1920, about 1923 to 2008, which was the kind of start date of this part of the study, and going on to the study released in 2012. So we see that water supply go all the way to 2012. On the right side of this vertical dashed bar, we see the projected future supply and demand. So these sort of shades instead of a solid line, because we're uncertain in what the future will be, but we do know we need to look at a wide variability to boost confidence in how ready we might be for what we see in the future. So the shaded red portion corresponds to the potential realm of projected water demand. And then the projected water supply here, I believe this data is from the general circulation model. So these are the climate change projections for what might happen to our water supply in the region, has quite a large uncertainty. And this is a 10-year water supply. But one keynote we do see is that more often than in the historical record, our water demand exceeds potentially greatly the projected water supply, highlighting sort of what we'll get to in these next steps for how can we respond to this. So unfortunately, it looks like this is a little bit of a blurry figure here, but I'll walk us through it. So the first step is to do the analysis of existing operations of that supply and demand imbalance we saw in that plot. So using the projected water supply and demand information, the future risks of the system were examined for a variety of sectors. This table on the right, which I'll read out the columns on the left, just to give us a reference point here, show the number of years or the percent of years during a 2041 to 2060, so a 20-year period, where our water infrastructure was projected to fail to meet its targets. So the sectors we looked at were water delivery, electrical power, flood control, water quality, recreation, as well as ecological concerns. These would be the concerns for are stream temperatures and flows sufficient to maintain habitat for some critical species. The water delivery case is what I'm going to focus on here for the sake of this talk, but I'm happy to address any questions later on. So for the water delivery, we have it split up into our ability to meet water supply requirements for the upper basin of the Colorado, as well as the lower basin. In the future, so this baseline case, we found that we failed to meet the targets in the upper basin in 7% of the years. And then the lower basin, I believe 19% of the years. So a little bit more of a struggle there to meet those targets. And this will serve as highlighting issues now that we can go in later to try and address potential adaptation or mitigation strategies to see if they can improve the performance or not. So task 3, now that we have the supply and demand projections, we know something about the supply and demand imbalances. We can apply the results of this analysis to develop potential options to increase system performance under climate change or just in general. Now, in the Basin Study Program, this is the part where we really emphasize that collaboration aspect of coordinating with study partners, stakeholders, and general public to identify specific strategies. Everyone has their own needs. Everyone knows their own limits. So in this aspect, we really get into who can do what to either make themselves more resilient to what climate change impacts may occur to them, or to say, the example here can cities reduce water supply through more energy or water efficient appliances? Are there technological advances we can make for agriculture irrigation, or do we need infrastructure changes? And then the follow-on for this step is to analyze these potential cost benefit to inform follow-on studies. For the Colorado River Basin, 150 options were received. So from the group of stakeholders and the general public that was involved, 150 adaptation and mitigation strategies were proposed. 30 were selected to be incorporated into the study, and they are organized into several large topics that I'll give examples of here. One being increased water supply. So this would be desalination of water. So that is the removal of salt from salty water to improve fresh water for use in either drinking water or irrigation, et cetera. Water reuse. So this might be taking sewage water or water that runs out of the tap in your home to recycle that and reintroduce it to the system. Watershed management as well as importation also included. The second category here would be the reduction of water demands. So this would be those examples of increased efficiency of irrigation methods to promote agricultural water conservation or energy water use efficiency, as well as modification to operations. So some of the examples looked at in the Colorado River Basin study were hypothetical coverings put on either canals or reservoirs to reduce the evaporation from reservoirs to keep that as part of the water supply, as opposed to a lost term. And how this was actually filtered into the study is these 30 selected options were put into 4 different portfolios that then informed different adaptation pathways for the study. So portfolio A included these 30 options. Portfolio B chose only the highest technical feasibility options, so the most readily implemented, which options are we most confident that we can actually implement with long-term reliability. So things that will hold up their benefit for a long-term, not just a few years. And we also, in this case, excluded options that have legal, policy, or permitting restrictions. Portfolio C includes only options of the 30 that have a low energy use and result in an increase in our in-stream flows. So this is kind of a more environmentally minded option. How can we make sure we're getting more in-stream flows to maintain habitat, as well as low energy use? So options that don't drastically add to the hydropower that we have to provide. In portfolio D, incorporated only both members of portfolio B and C. So this would be options that had high technical feasibility, so very confident that we could implement, would last for a long term, and also had low energy use and these ecological benefits. Again, happy to discuss maybe these more in detail, but just an example of how we're looking at potential adaptation mitigation strategies in lieu of these supply and demand imbalances. The final task of task 4, sort of what we've all been leading up to by working through these background information so far, is can we improve the performance of our system now that we've identified where it does well, where it does poorly, where it needs help, and where in the future we might have some issues that we need to work out. This step in the Basin study is where we put these adaptation options into the planning model to try and evaluate, is there actually an appreciable volume of water conserved? What's the time to get this return? What's the time needed to get this water conservation in our system? What the technical complexity is of these options, how much do they cost, and if there are any legal and policy considerations. For the Colorado River Basin study, quite an exhaustive report that addressed all of these sectors, but here I'm just going to focus on the water supply example. Now, this figure on the right has using the same water demand scenario and looking at each of these different portfolios and the no action baseline. How often do we fail to meet our targets for water supply in the upper basin and the lower basin using the different water supply hydrologies. So this top column here, this left column with the observed water supply is using the hydrology from the past 100 years that we have data for, there are observations for. And we see that there's upper basin seems to be fine. The lower basin, for the baseline portfolio, we have some failure, but each portfolio remedies this. For the paleo conditions, so these are hydrology informed by this longer, about 1,000-year data set informed by tree rings near streams. We see similar picture for the upper basin. The lower basin, we see slightly more vulnerability. So we've gone to from a 7% to a 9% in the baseline scenario. However, we see the same reduction across all of the adaptation portfolios, except for portfolio D has just a 1%. The interesting part, we've noticed that compared to the past 1,000 years, when we look at projections from general circulation models, we noticed that for the upper basin, we have substantially more problems, which is indicative of things we need to prepare for. So we have 18% in the baseline. We still get a reduction using all of these adaptation portfolios, but it's not to zero. In the lower basin, we are at 44%. So almost half of the time we are failing to meet targets if we don't change something. With all of these portfolios, we get a significant reduction to just order 11% to 20%. So we get substantial improvements. However, it's highlighting that the hydrology we're expecting in the future is different than anything we've experienced in the past 1,000 years in our paleo record. And that shows up when we look at our water supply and demand imbalances. So we've kind of built up that through the Basin study. We've identified some potential paths forward for people to look at implementing. And now we have some sort of follow-ons that go after the Basin study program that we can discuss a little bit here at the end. So before I turn it back to Avra, I just want to highlight some of the key results here that we teased out for the Colorado River Basin. So one, we got a lot of people talking that otherwise would not be in the same room to work on these issues, that people upstream that may, if they increase their agricultural need, that's water taken from downstream. These people in the same room through this sort of planning framework brought a lot of different understanding of the needs, and thus allowed us to highlight a lot of potential adaptation pathways forward and to show this common research for what is likely to happen across the basin. We also noticed just now that the future imbalances from projected hydrology using general circulation models are larger than anything in the 1,000-year paleo record. And in lieu of this kind of alarming news, we did demonstrate that several potential adaptation and mitigation strategies to lessen the projected impact of changing water supply and demand do exist. We looked at some of them in brief through this study, and there's been some follow-on since then, accentuated by the continued drought in the Colorado Basin. But for now, I will hand it back to Avra to talk about sort of what happens after a basin study.
Thanks, Kevin. So what happens next after completing a basin study? As Kevin mentioned, the Colorado River Basin study was completed in the year 2012. I believe it was started in 2010 and completed in 2012. In this year, 2022, we are now in an unprecedented drought that is lasting 23 years and counting. The longest drought that we've experienced in the Colorado River Basin in 2,000 years. And so since that time that the basin study was concluded, when we were working with our stakeholders and first understanding that looking into the future, we were seeing kind of signs that this drought might be continuing, might be longer than we expected. And now we're experiencing those conditions in 2022. Because of the severe drought this year, Reclamation, which is the water master on the Colorado River, declared shortage. That means that under the compact, we are not able to meet all of our compact demands for allocating water between the upper Colorado River Basin and the lower Colorado River Basin into Mexico. And so because we're not able to do that, we have entered what is called shortage requirements. And shortage requirements means that the allocations going to individual states are cut from what they would normally be. And this is the first time that shortage requirements have been triggered in the history of the Colorado River Compact. So pretty significant outcome of this very long drought. What is positive about the Basin study and the follow-on efforts is that the Basin study helped establish a technical foundation within the Colorado River. I'm not sure whether we mentioned this, but the Basin study itself involved participation by 7 different states that comprise the upper and lower Colorado River Basin. So it was really a remarkable effort to bring all of these different states to the table, and plus the entities that Stephanie walked through in her slides, showing you that we had participation by tribes, by irrigation and water districts, by municipalities, by state entities, environmental groups, all coming together to work on the Basin study. And going through the analysis that Stephanie and Kevin described here in the slides, with these stakeholders on board, with these partners on board during the analysis, helps them to understand what the real conditions are within the basin. And bringing everybody along and presenting an analysis that they could understand and they could trust, and they understand the modeling and they understand the outcomes, helps everybody have be on the same page, helps everybody have a common understanding of the hydrology in the basin. And that means that people don't have an unrealistic expectation. Nobody likes the fact that we're in such a long drought, or that we have now entered this shortage sharing requirement that was triggered under the compact. But nobody's surprised by this either. And folks have, the partners that participated in the Basin study have a good understanding of the hydrology, and therefore they don't have unrealistic expectations. Currently, Reclamation and our non-federal partners are taking exceptional actions within the Colorado River Basin to maintain reservoir levels, maintain our ability to generate hydropower, and to maintain water deliveries to the extent possible. Some of these measures that we're taking include cutting back drastically on the amount of agriculture, irrigated land within the Colorado River Basin. So farmers are fallowing fields. We are undertaking a massive effort to cut consumption, to cut water demand within the Colorado River Basin to address these drought conditions. And then many of the actions that were identified in the Basin study, looking at how we can use water reuse and recycling, how can we use water conservation, even water marketing or water exchanges. All of these tools are being used now to help stretch the scarce water supplies that we have currently due to the drought conditions in the Colorado River Basin. Next slide. So we've shown you what the Basin studies are and what the work entails. And the question is, are we having any success? Well, we have managed to fund 27 different Basin studies since 2009. And those individual Basin studies have brought together a collection of partners in each of those 27 studies, which are spread across the Western United States. We've brought together a set of partners, key partners within each basin, who now have science and tools. So they have the models and the hydrology that was developed during those Basin studies. They have experience collaborating and working together and getting to know each other and building trust. And we have seen many follow-on efforts that that were born from a basin study, that were initiated as a result of a basin study. We've listed 8 specific follow-on projects where we have allocated funding. The Bureau of Reclamation has allocated funding to do different types of follow-on efforts. Typically, these involve drilling into, I should say, looking more closely at the adaptation or mitigation strategies that are developed in a basin study. So we have funded some basin study partners to do more work on those adaptation strategies and to get down to the level of how would we actually implement a widespread conservation program or a water reuse and recycling program, or what infrastructure would we actually need to build to help us meet our water supply needs. We have also seen basin study partners, non-federal entities, take it upon themselves to fund some of the projects that we have identified in some of these basin studies. So we also consider that a success. Our goal in the Basin Study Program is to build collaboration, to build a foundation in science and hydrology, and to avoid or help avoid conflict over water and help build collaborative solutions instead of allowing conflict to arise. So we think that the program has been very successful, and we look forward to funding more studies in the future. Next slide. This is just a resource that we have that is available online, and it shows our WaterSMART programs. If you were interested, you could go in and look at where the different basin studies are. Some of those large spots on the map actually represent basin studies. You can see they're shown in red or pink there. And then some of the other types of projects that we fund are also, you can use this tool to search on, it's an interactive web-based tool that allows you to search and look at our different programs and different projects that we've funded and learn a little bit more about the projects. Next slide. And with that, you have here... Oh, sorry. All right. Let's see. Did someone have a question?
Mənim sualım var. Mən Gəncədən, Agrar Universitetdən.
Yes, I am from Ganja, from Agrarian University. I am from Melioration faculty, Professor Minayev Musalov. I have a question.
Hə. Sual vermək olar da yəqin ki.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Hə. Mən diqqətlə qulaq asdım. Səhərdən qoşulmuşam mən saat 8-də.
I have been here from 8 and I was listening very carefully to the presentation. Very interesting issues are covered here.
Baseyndə deməli çox illik
as a result of this basin study of Colorado River.
Getdi. Deməli burada
you talked about projection
balansı müəyyənləşdirmək üçün
and supply demand disbalances between them.
Hidrogeoloji və quru hissədə
both naturally, hydrologically, and also
bilmək istərdim ki, bu proqnozu müəyyənləşdirmək.
You have to give projection on the basin, etc. So I want to know them to identify the disbalances between demand and supply.
Alo.
Did you get the question?
You were cutting out a little bit. I think if you could repeat it one more time, that would be helpful.
Deməli, elə sadəcə olaraq Colorado sistemi proqramı quruldu.
So my question is specifically on this basin study in order to make long-term projection in the Colorado water basin.
hidroloji, hidrogeoloji ve kuru hidroloji.
In order to identify the water movement dynamics, what type of methodology did you use? Hydrological, groundwater research, etc. In order to further see the disbalances or balances between demand and supply in the future. So what type of hydro methodology did you specifically use within this study?
Avro, were you able to hear the question that time?
I was not able to hear the question. I don't know if others in my group were.
I did not hear the question in English.
Are you guys in the English channel on the interpretation?
So you need to
No.
click.
Maybe
you
we
need
should stop
Yeah.
sharing
Yeah.
and go to interpretation. Okay, English.
So this is Marquetta. Can you hear me?
Yes, Marquetta, we can hear you.
Great. I think I heard the question, but maybe I should maybe say it back to make sure that I understand. I think the question is what sorts of methodologies were used to develop the hydrology that went into the water supply and demand analysis?
Hidroloji, hidrogeoloji ve kurunun
Hydrology, hydrogeology, and ground
And groundwater, so surface
what
water
type
and
of
groundwater
methodology did you use?
hydrology.
Yes, you did. You get it.
Great. I can start to answer that question and others may
Yes.
add to my answer. So in this particular study, and this is typical of the basin studies in general, we often use precipitation and temperature data sets as input to a hydrology model. In this case, we use the variable infiltration capacity model, or VIC, which has been used quite a bit across the globe. It was developed by the University of Washington. It's a common hydrology model that takes precipitation and temperature inputs, as well as land cover, vegetation types, soil characteristics, and simulates stream flow. Those stream flows are the inputs into our river systems models that we use to simulate how water travels through the system in terms of river operations. I think for groundwater in this case, I believe there was a fairly simple approach used for quantifying groundwater and surface water interactions because of the large geographic scale of this study.
Was there something added to the chat as well?
Yes, if you look in the chat, our colleague Roman Ferdinand has added links to the VIC instruction and overview documents that you can please feel free to review as well.
Yeah. I guess I'll say for these studies, it's very beneficial to have a common hydrologic modeling tool to use and apply over the entire basin. And also, you know, a common tool that we can use in different river basins across the United States.
Aydın'dı. Bizce kelime bir xırda bir sualım da var.
Thank you very much for the answer. I have another question, if possible. In water management, limitations, limited
Dünya miqyasında tətbiq olunmaq
use of water. Does it apply only to Colorado of water basin? And do you think it's reasonable to apply these water limitations on consumption of water worldwide or only for the drought regions like Colorado?
I heard part of the question, but not the whole question. I got the gist that the question was about.
The question is, do you think putting limitations on water consumption is reasonable for all other water basins worldwide, or only like during the drought regions like in Colorado you did?
I can try to answer. This is Roman Ferdinand. Cutting water consumption is certainly the fastest way on how to get handle on the imbalance between supply and demand. Cutting water supply is very unpopular, even though it is quick action. It is not necessarily saved. It is saved for really extreme conditions.
Thank you, Roman. Yes, and we are in extreme conditions in the Colorado River Basin right now. Otherwise, nobody would be cutting consumption. It's never the first choice. And even in the Colorado River Basin, we are pursuing other options alongside cutting consumption. We are looking at treating water and reusing water, and just being more efficient in how we manage water with our irrigation delivery systems and our water supplies that we provide to cities using better technology and meters to measure water. So in this situation where the drought is so extreme,
thank you very much.
We're using every tool.
Minnettarım. Ancaq məlumat vermək istəyirəm ki, 2013-cü ildə
Thank you very much. Thank you for your answer. In 2013, I have visited Colorado within Cochrane project. And actually, I got very detailed information about this project as well. So thank you very much for detailed information that you gave on behalf of Azerbaijan and specifically our university. Thank you for your comprehensive answer and presentations as well.
Thank you. Thank you for your question.
All right, I think at this point we have opened the floor for questions. I would be happy to send the email addresses that were on the final slide out to the group afterwards so that we can go ahead and move forward with any other questions that folks might have. I see a raised hand from Asif. Please go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Salam, hər vaxtınız xeyir.
Good morning, everyone. Actually, it was very interesting and detailed presentation, comprehensive presentation. That's why I have several questions to ask, but I will select one of them to ask.
Please go ahead. Thank you.
Birinci sualım mənim o.
My first question is about identification of snow flow resources in the mountainous area. In the mountainous areas, in order to identify snow reservoirs, I want to know, do you have any automated snow flow evaluation stations? How do I identify the scale, volume, etc.? And also, of course, temperature should be considered, as I understand. So while identifying these snow reserves in the mountains, do you use any automated stations or you use space satellite information? So how the evaluation of these snow resources is happening?
Thank you. Go ahead, Kevin.
Thanks for your question. So I can start this, but I'll definitely tap Marquetta and others to maybe fill in some of the gaps. So in some stations, we do have weather stations measuring snowpack, so the thickness of the snow cover, and track that throughout the season. We also do have some programs, though not in this basin study, to do unmanned flights or manned flights over snow areas and to use some instrumentation to determine the thickness of the snowpack at a more a larger spatial area. With regards to the spaceborne instrumentation, I am less familiar with that, and I do know that as you mentioned, you know, the temperature is a concern. So these weather stations that measure snowpack thickness, often we have corresponding temperature measurements as well. And we're also noticing that there are changes to the albedo, so the reflectivity of the snow itself, that might be due to dust or ash from wildfire, which can increase the rate of the melting. And then the further concern of, you know, once that snow has melted, how it makes its way through the subsurface layer. But for maybe to circle back to the direct, there are some weather stations, there are some flight-based observation platforms, and I know the spaceborne observations exist. I'm unsure how good they are or how they're used, but maybe Marquetta or Stephanie, you can jump in there as well.
Yeah, thanks, Kevin. This is Marquetta. I would say we use a combination of all of those tools. We use satellite imagery, we use individual station measurements. In terms of the satellite imagery, we often use them in combination with models. So the satellite images typically give you snow cover area, but cannot tell you, you know, the water content necessarily within those snow covered areas. So we complement those satellite images with models to arrive at actual snow water equivalent or the amount of water stored in those snow reservoirs. And for something like a basin study, we often use hydrology models to model snowpack and how snowpack changes over time. But we do use station observations to verify those models and calibrate them.
Thank you so much to both of you. And just to chime in on our next session real quick, I wanted to turn the floor over really quickly to my colleague, Mike Strobel, previously with the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Natural Resource Conservation Service, who works quite closely with snowpack telemetry and snowpack data to quickly, you know, make any comments or additions he might have.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The only thing I'd mention is that on November 2nd, we will cover the workshop on that date. We'll cover the snow survey program in the Western US, which I was the director of for 15 years. So I'd be happy to address that. Additionally, about the in situ stations and our water supply forecasting in the West related to the snowpack at that time.
Thanks so much, Mike. Asif, did that answer your first question?
Çok sağ olun, teşekkür ederim.
Yes, thank you very much. Completely finished with the first one. I have second question. And I know that the time is limited. That's why this will be my last question. Concerning adaptation mitigation measures, you said you use different scenarios. For example, through Azerbaijan, we have trans-border river Kura passing, and Azerbaijan is located on the lower basin. So in order to apply that scenario for Kura River, Kura passes through Turkey, Georgia, and Azerbaijan. We are the last country, let's say. If Azerbaijan uses this model, does it mean that we have to prepare regional model for this between 3 countries, or you can apply it to our part of the Kura River only as well?
This is Marketa. I will try to answer that. I would say really the important question is if you have the data in terms of the stream flow coming from those other countries. I understand that Azerbaijan may be the sort of the last country the river flows through before it gets to the sea. So as long as you have those stream flow inputs, you could concentrate your model to just your region.
Yani çayın yukarı hissəsində sudan istifadə.
So meaning that we have to get data how the river is used on the upper parts, right?
That would be ideal, yes. I know that can be very difficult.
Çox sağ olun, minnətdaram.
Thank you very much. Thank you for detailed answer as well.
This is Roman. I would like to just mention, you still can develop your hydrology VIC model for the area of interest. However, whatever flows into your area of interest as input, you have to have that information. So if the input is precipitation, great, you have that. But your river actually is an input. It flows from upstream country. And it will be difficult to model your area without knowing the input. You can set up the stream flow station right at the border, and you can measure your own stream flow right at the border with the country, with the upstream country. But you, in terms of projections into the future, you are at the mercy of the upstream country, right? They can do whatever they want to, and your stream flow data will be different, and you cannot predict the future without some sort of cooperation and understanding with the upstream countries. But again, you can use the VIG model for any watershed you want. You just have to have all input data together.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, Roman.
Great. Any additional questions?
Aydındır, çox sağ olun.
Thank you very much.
Please feel free to add things to the chat or to raise your hand to indicate you'd like to ask a question. Happy to give folks a little bit of time. I know that the presentation was very comprehensive and had a lot of material and information to digest.
Hi, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, this is Blake. All right, so are we at the end of the presentation and we're just waiting questions right now?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
We would be happy to receive more questions if there are any. Otherwise, as Mike mentioned, we have our second session coming up on November 2nd. And we will have 2 more following that. And so we'd be happy to continue to answer questions over email in the weeks to come, of
Great.
course.
So that was my follow-up question. If people have, if there's follow-up questions that that our experts on the Azerbaijan side might have, they have the contact information to reach out.
Yes, absolutely. And I would be more than happy to share both the slides as well as the contact information to you guys at the embassy, and you can pass it along shortly after this call ends. But of course, we do have a little bit of time remaining. So if there are any questions or any burning thoughts to share now, we would more than welcome folks to jump in. All right, I am seeing none. In which case, Blake, do you think it would be appropriate to go ahead and plan to wrap up a little bit early and set the stage for our session coming up on November 2nd?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so are you going to talk a little bit about what that's about? It sounds like it's about snowpack, and but if you can give a little primer for what that will be so people can prepare. And yeah, I thought that was really very interesting, and really appreciate everybody's participation. And that's actually truly very exciting to see where this can go and continuing this conversation. So I want to extend my thanks to everybody involved, and I look forward to the next session. Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Blake. Yes, more than happy to talk about give a brief overview of the next session, though as I'm not a technical expert, I would kindly ask Mike if there's anything you would like to share in terms of a 30-second summary of what they can expect in the next session. That would be great.
You bet, sure. So the next session will cover the snow survey and water supply forecasting program in the Western US. It complements the presentation we had today, where we were looking at the basins and stream flow and water supplies. This program looks at snowpack and utilizes that information to model and forecast water supplies throughout the Western US. So the snowpack in the wintertime is part of the spring and summer water supplies for agriculture, as well as other uses in the Western US. And so I'll be covering that history of the program, some background on how we put together our tools, and some of the graphics of how we represent the conditions. So next, that'll be on November 2nd.
Thanks so much, Mike. Yes, as he mentioned, it'll be at the same time as today's session on November 2nd, and we're very much looking forward to it. In the interim, if you have any questions or you would like any additional information about either this session or any of the upcoming sessions, we encourage you to reach out. We'd be more than happy to share the information we have. For now, I would like to once again thank our excellent speakers for their presentation today. We really appreciate their willingness to join so late in the evening here in the United States. We'd also like to thank our U.S. Embassy colleagues and Azeri counterparts for their hard work in organizing today's session, which, as mentioned in the beginning of today's event, was many months in the making. Finally, I'd like to thank the interpreter for making this session possible. I can promise you that we wouldn't have gotten nearly this far if I was expected to answer questions in the Azeri language. So thank you so much to our interpreter colleague. And with that, I think we will go ahead and wrap up for today. And I wish you all a very pleasant rest of your day and look forward to talking more in a couple weeks.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.